Welcome everybody to the IYEA's latest session on emerging trade conflicts and economic and legal dimensions of the same. Today we have with us Mr. Akshay, who's got a wide variety of experience in not just handling economic and legal dimensions of trade, but even other global policy developments. He presently is Senior Advisor at SSA Associates and focuses on policy development in Asia Pacific. Trade conflicts have been around for centuries, perhaps for the last 500 to 600, and they have somehow become more increasingly relevant, as Akshay will be talking about today, in the last few years. It's a natural course that from free trade to protectionism and back to free trade and protectionism, but whether or not such a course is natural and whether we can predict such a path is something that Akshay will be discussing and sharing today. And we hope that all of you will have a great session. Akshay, over to you.
So, essentially the way I had planned the session is that we would cover 5 sort of sub-areas. I thought I would begin by giving you an introduction just into what is this idea of trade conflict, why are they rising, how are they being prosecuted. I'll talk to you about what's happening in the WTO, why it's failing or not failing to check some of these conflicts. I'll talk to you about 2 specific conflicts as trade conflicts as a sort of a case study. So we look at the US-China conflict, we look at the US-India conflict, and those are important for us sitting here in India. I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the role of the EU, why we need to look at that, why it's a major player, and then essentially just conclude by a couple of final thoughts on, what are these emerging trends in the world of trade that we have to be cognizant of. And a few key takeaways. What do I want you all to actually take away from the session? One, you will just get an idea as to what these trade conflicts or trade wars are all about, and why and exactly how they're being prosecuted. What are the various actions that are being taken? What are the legal dimensions of those actions? What's the economic rationale behind them? Is there business support? Is there not business support? What's happening within the conversations on trade policy and related economic policy issues in 4 major geographies? That would be the EU, China, India, and the US. And lastly, I wanted to leave you all with some, very big picture views or big picture trends on what is happening in the world of trade, because I believe that y'all, in going out as people who might work as lawyers or as business people or as policymakers, researchers, if you work in academia, these are issues that are going to impact you, whether directly or indirectly. So it is something that, y'all need to keep in mind. Sure. So right. So let me get straight into the topic. When I was talking about trade conflicts and trade wars, there's been a lot of headlines on trade wars in the last few years, and these are across. These aren't just limited to stuff that the US is doing. This is, over the last 2 to 3 months, there's an Australia-China sort of trade war that has broken out. Everyone is aware of what's happening between India and China. There was a Japan-South Korea trade war that started in 2019 and is still sort of ongoing. And then there are, of course, US-China, US-India, possibly a US-EU conflict that might break out as well. And just to give you just some examples of what we were covering and some of the key issues around which these trade wars are now being fought, I will get into all these in more detail, but just to give you an idea of the absolute breadth that's being covered right now. So it's, as the previous slide did, it's pretty crazy, for lack of a better term, and for someone who's it can be quite chaotic because there are, there are multiple things happening in different directions. And the one last point that I wanted to leave with y'all on this, and this is something that I want you to keep in mind throughout this whole session, is that a lot of these trade conflicts have been, have either been have started or have their origin or have been accelerated by non-trade issues. So if I can give, so that's sort of we're moving to a space of when trade is now being weaponized to essentially achieve objectives in certain non-trade policy areas. So to give you an example with some of these, the Australia-China trade dispute actually began because Australia demanded that there be an inquiry into the origin of COVID-19. And then China responded by raising tariffs on barley and beef and so on and so forth. The India-China issue, I mean, there have been trade disagreements going for a long time, but the catalyst for the recent steps that have been taken was the issue of the border. Similarly, with South Korea and Japan, there are legacy colonial issues, so on and so forth, that have actually contributed to some of these actions and retaliatory steps that both South Korea and Japan have taken. And so therefore, this obviously has an impact. So the WTO, the World Trade Organization, actually tracks trade volumes in terms of goods and services. And if you look at from 2008 to 2019, when these really intensified, you can see that there's been a fall both, there's been a fall largely in goods. And goods fell by about 3%. Services had gone up by about 2%, but overall, there was, if you look at both goods and services together, there was a fall. And even when services increased by about 2% in 2019, over 2017 to 2018, it had actually increased by 8%. So even the rate of growth is slowing. And when there's no growth, as in goods, there's obviously, that's largely on account of what's happening here. And important to note, because of COVID, the WTO Director General issued a press release, I think about a month ago, where the expectation is that goods trade could fall between 13 and 32% in 2020. So that's a very, very significant fall that is being expected. Great. And another stat that I thought was something that you all should keep in mind, what the WTO also does is it tracks trade measures that are enacted by various countries, and it categorizes them as measures that either facilitate trade or measures that restrict trade. And what it has found is that currently, while the number of measures that restrict trade, are less compared to say maybe 3 or 4 years ago, the trade coverage, that's the total volume value of trade that's covered by these measures, is probably the highest that it has ever been. And if you look at the graph on the chart on the right, if you look at 2019, the period that's under consideration, it's almost $750 billion is covered by trade restrictive measures, and it was just under 600 about almost a year ago. So there has been this surge in protectionism. There's a surge in what we call unilateralism. And I guess the question to ask is that whether we consider this a failure of the WTO. So that helps me sort of segue into the next section when I talk about what's happening at the WTO. This is sort of a basket of the various criticisms that have been levied on the WTO, particularly recently by various stakeholders. If I start with what I would say the political left, or the left side of the political aisle has had this criticism ever since the WTO began, which we can call sort of the neoliberal critique, that the WTO is only biased towards large corporations, multinationals, does not look at the interests of workers, farmers, and therefore it's widened the gap between rich countries and poor countries, or developed countries and developing countries. And a lot of this conversation, this criticism has been driven by the failure of the Doha round, which was supposed to be the next major trade negotiation that would address the concerns of developing countries. Doha round, as many of you all may know, has literally broke down in about 2008, 2009, and really hasn't moved since then. And then allied to that, of course, there are subsequent criticisms that the WTO does not focus on labor and environmental issues. There's an issue in terms of IPR. The TRIPS agreement was one of the agreements negotiated in the 90s as part of the Uruguay round discussions. And then there's this conversation about whether drugs should be patented or you should actually allow cheaper drugs to serve public health needs. And India is a very big player in this conversation because India is a major supplier of cheap drugs to developing countries, least developed countries in Africa, even developing countries in South America and Central Asia. And developed countries such as the US and the EU are putting pressure on the Indian government to revamp its existing patent regime to be more aligned to what the US and the EU want, but then that has significant public health concerns that could be raised. One criticism that I'm talking about, which is the non-discrimination requirement. Now, this is a very, very key criticism, and I want people to get this concept very clear. And this is the central tension that has now appeared, and it's a very fundamental tension that we're talking about. So the WTO was formed to push the principles of non-discrimination, that one country should not essentially discriminate against another on the matter of trade. And there are two broad principles that the WTO follows, which again, a lot of you may be aware of. One is known as MFN, or most favored nation treatment, which basically says that if I am tariffing a particular good, I have to put the same tariff for all WTO member nations. So that's what's called. So I cannot discriminate on tariffs between nation A and nation B as long as they are WTO members. And of course, there are exceptions to this, which is called free trade agreements. But those exceptions only work in limited cases when the exception covers all trade, right? But in general, for a particular good, the base principle is that you cannot discriminate between country A and country B. Similarly, the other concept, which I'm called NT here, is called national treatment. So national treatment is wherein I don't discriminate between domestic and foreign companies within my country. I don't discriminate between domestic goods and foreign goods, right? I need to ensure that from a policy point of view, from a regulatory point of view, tax point of view, I need to treat these goods the same. And where this concept of non-discrimination is now chafing up against is that various countries now want to positively discriminate. So there are areas and communities where they believe that we need to take specific economic measures because these have been, say, historically underprivileged communities or these are marginalized communities. So we need something extra to help these communities. Now, when I provide that extra in terms of policy, whatever that case may be, that could be considered as discrimination technically under WTO requirements. And now that's where this clash has essentially come in. And that's why you have these allegations of interference, and the WTO is sticking its nose in domestic matters. It is essentially, you may want to discriminate for certain developmental reasons or for certain sovereignty reasons or for certain, as part of a political strategy in your country. But if that falls in contravention of the non-discrimination requirements of the WTO can rule that it is non-compliant, and then you may not be able to execute that policy. So that has led to a lot of existing criticism of the organization. And again, contributing to that is that the rules have been out of date. So rules were defined in the 80s and the early 90s. There hasn't really been a serious attempt to reform those. The Doha round was that. Nothing happened in more than a decade. And then that is now, over the last few years, particularly the US, you've got these massive criticisms coming in that the WTO cannot discipline non-compliant economies, basically talking about China, and the US turning around and saying that the WTO is interfering in domestic legislative and regulatory space, which is again going back to this whole idea of non-discrimination versus you may want positive discrimination in your regulatory policy. So the question we need to ask is that, is this valid, right? And that's essentially what we need to look at as policymakers and as people who work within this field. And in order to do that, I need to sort of digress and go into a quick history lesson. So the origins of the WTO and the existing trade architecture, as it were laid at the end of World War II, when you had these major conferences that led to the formation of the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, right? And at that time, there was, so the two main Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, but there was a third institution that was also discussed at that point in time, known as the ITO, the International Trade Organization. And that is basically what the WTO was in its original form. And so when countries started these discussions, beginning in 1944, they discussed the UN, they discussed the World Bank, they discussed the ITO. They also started discussing this treaty, which essentially looked at massive tariff concessions to be provided amongst the signatories of that treaty. And the reason for why tariff concessions was a focus was because countries at that point in time believed, or at least the World War II winners believed, that the policies that had been put into place, particularly the protectionist policies, for example, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the US, that were put into place following the Great Depression, had actually intensified the economic crisis and had actually was a cause of World War II breaking out. So in order to avoid a repeat of that, they decided to focus on forming these new multilateral organizations and these massive tariff concessions. But what happened is, because of sovereignty reasons and such, while the ITO was agreed, there was a charter that was developed at a conference in Havana in 1947, the US Congress, for sovereignty reasons, refused to ratify that charter. And by 1950, all attempts had been exhausted. So essentially the ITO just died without ever being born. But what they had is they had already negotiated the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. So they decided to use the GATT as a sort of a platform, if you will, on which to base further trade liberalization over the years. And that's exactly what we saw. There were multiple rounds of further tariff negotiations in France, in England, in Geneva. The Dillon round also happened in Geneva. That's named after a former US Secretary of Commerce. And then until the Kennedy round, which was inspired by John F. Kennedy, that's when for the first time in the 60s, they moved beyond just tariff concessions and they got into other areas and they came out with an anti-dumping agreement. And then they used that positive progress forward. More countries joined in. In the Tokyo round, we had more than 100 countries. Now they started talking not just about anti-dumping and tariffs, but they went into non-tariff barriers. They had a number of plurilateral agreements, which are sector-specific agreements that countries had agreed to. They had four: one on civil aviation, government procurement, dairy, and beef, all right? Of which two have now expired, but during the Tokyo round, they'd actually managed to negotiate on this. And then, of course, the Uruguay round, when you had almost 120 countries, and when in the Uruguay round, they covered everything, as much as they could. They looked at services, they looked at agriculture, dispute resolution, intellectual property rights, and eventually they came up with this new organization known as the WTO, which would go forward and would assist and facilitate further progress in all of these. And then, of course, the Doha round was the next round. It began in 2001, but the Doha round, as I have said, is broken down. So that just gives you an idea of what the thought process was leading up to the formation of the WTO. Going forward, specifically looking at the year 1994 when the WTO was formed, what was in the mind of the people who were doing the negotiations and actually formed these organizations? So you can broadly break the purpose of the WTO into two linked but disparate objectives. The first one is what I would simplistically call as dispute resolution, which is managing trade relations between countries, right? Ensuring that what they agreed to as part of the Uruguay round, they adhered to, they were compliant. And then figuring out a way of disciplining countries that were not compliant with what the Uruguay round required, right? So that was the dispute resolution part of it. The second part of it was further liberalization, what was epitomized in the Doha round, right? We want to expand market access, particularly agriculture and services, because agriculture and services being very, very politically sensitive areas, they did not make significant progress during the Uruguay round. They decided to leave that for further negotiations and all. Subsidies, industrial subsidies, agricultural subsidies, very, very politically sensitive, was something that they deferred to the other round, right? So the WTO was essentially formed with these two objectives in mind. And the key assumption that the negotiators had at that point in time was that countries that were not market economies, Western style market economies, so they call them non-market economies, would soon start becoming market economies. And you have to look at why this assumption was there, is because you have to look at the thought process and what history was at that point in time. That just in the fall of the Soviet Union, we had Francis Fukuyama saying this is the end of history. Washington consensus was there. So everyone thought that further liberalization and deregulation was the way to go, and the WTO would be a leading player in ensuring that, you know, previously more state-run countries, state-run economies would become market economies like what you had in the West. So if I go back and specifically look at these two objectives and see whether what progress has been made by the WTO on these, if I look at the whole dispute resolution, monitoring, implementation of it, there has been a lot of criticism, or a lot of it being valid criticism. And in fact, a very, very good summary of the criticism of the entire dispute resolution settlement procedures, the US Trade Representative, which is the US government's main trade agency, which is part of the Executive Office of the President, released a report in February this year, where in great detail, they listed out what their specific criticisms of the appellate body were. The appellate body, just for people who don't know, the WTO, when it does dispute resolution, it has something known as a dispute settlement body that comprises all the members of the WTO. And every time there is a dispute that goes to the DSB, the dispute settlement body, they form a panel which is going to hear that dispute. And then the panel comes out with a ruling as and when, however long that takes. But if, let's say, the losing country, which is the panel issues a ruling that goes against one country, that country then can appeal, which as in most jurisprudence happens, to what is called the appellate body. And then the appellate body can either uphold the panel's decision or then can decide to do something different, right? And as you probably would know, most countries that lose a ruling at the panel level would appeal further to the appellate body. So the US has actually criticized the working with the appellate body. I'm not going to get into too much detail. I've already covered most of what the US has said, but I would recommend that if anyone has time, they should read that report. But the key point here is that one of the major reasons why the US has criticized it, and not just the US, but a lot of other countries as well, is that they felt that the WTO would be able to very quickly, smoothly discipline non-market economies, non-compliant nations, but that has not happened. And in fact, one of the most major criticisms that the US has is that the WTO has been very, very weak on disciplining China, and that's why this whole process needs a reform. Similarly, when I go into the other objective, which is further trade negotiations, the Doha round has broken down over a number of issues. Agricultural subsidies in developed countries, agricultural subsidies across has been an issue, but right now the main sticking point is subsidies in developed countries, right? That's where the conversation has stopped. Then, of course, there are market access issues in developing countries, high tariffs, so on and so forth. And then one issue really is, which I want to touch on, is called special and differential status. So under the WTO, developing countries can self-declare themselves as developing countries. And why this is advantageous for them is because when the WTO agrees on certain commitments that need to be implemented, developed countries have lesser timelines, developing countries get much more time to implement those commitments. So the US might get 5 years, let's say, phase out certain subsidies, whereas a developing country might get 10 years or 15 years, right? And so what the US in particular has been levying this criticism that China should not be considered a developing country. India should not be considered a developing country. They should not have this special and differential status. And that's where the conversation is. And because we've only had actually one major new agreement that's come out, which is known as the Trade Facilitation Agreement. And in fact, these exceptions are now becoming the norm. The exceptions are free trade agreements because you can't get global consensus on an issue. So then 2 countries or 3 countries together gang up and say, okay, we've got agreement. So we're going to sign a free trade agreement that covers all trade. Now you've got bilateral exceptions, bilateral FTAs. You've got regional exceptions like the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is about 11 countries in Asia and the Pacific. You have region-to-region agreements that some countries are looking at, for example, in the EU. So this has been, that's rather than go towards more global multilateral negotiations, you've got a lot more fragmentation. And again, this relies on the false assumption back in 1994, is that you assumed that all non-market economies would become like market economies. That means you assume that there would be some common understanding on what the rules of trade would be. But as countries, that progression has not happened. Different countries, based on their internal systems, have very, very different perceptions and demands in terms of what they want those rules to be, which is why you really have not had any breakthrough on these wider negotiations. So, unless, of course, there's real reform in the WTO, further marginalization is possible. Just to get quickly deeper, and because you're all students of law, the main problem with the WTO today is that you're using the WTO, which is a judicial body, essentially, the dispute settlement part at least, to solve what are essentially political issues or issues that need to be solved through political negotiations between countries. And you are looking for judicial solutions to those through the dispute settlement system. Until those political negotiations do not happen, and that is what you mean by real reform, the WTO is going to remain very, very ill-equipped to deal with these global challenges. And so you are going to see, in the absence of that real reform, more protectionism, more FTAs, these exceptions to the norm, and that's essentially where the challenge lies at the moment. So getting now into some of these disputes specifically, when I get into the EU-China trade conflict, the origins of this dispute are not new. This is not something that has come up ever since Donald Trump was elected. Going a little bit back into history, China joined the WTO at the end of around 1999-2000. And the expectation was that China would become a market economy. In fact, one of the rules, the agreement, the clauses in the agreement of China's accession to the WTO was that even though China was a WTO member, for the next 15 years until 2015, all countries would be able to consider China as a non-market economy for the purpose of trade policy and trade actions. And only after those 15 years would China be able to be considered a market economy, right? And what we've seen is that following 2000, those desired changes in China have not happened. And correspondingly, there have been a number of complaints being raised by the US private sector on Chinese trade and economic practices. And you are familiar with many of these. They relate to intellectual property, forced technology transfers, discriminatory licensing, cyber espionage, IPR theft, predatory market practices. So say Chinese companies getting massively hidden subsidies, which allows them to undercut foreign competitors on price, gain market share, and then once you are the dominant player in that market, and your competitors reduced to a shadow of itself, you can just quickly go and buy it out and take it over, and then essentially you're controlling the market. And that's been a practice that we've seen in a number of Chinese companies. I worked on a few issues for clients on some of those. And further, we find these practices being more linked to the technology sector. And that has therefore raised a number of national security concerns in a number of countries. So when China joined over the Bush administration, they thought that China would make those changes. By the time the Bush administration's term ended and the Obama administration came in, they started realizing that, oh, perhaps China may not actually make those changes. So the Obama administration started filing WTO disputes against China. But as we've discussed, they had very, very limited progress on those. And then the situation just kept getting worse and worse and worse until it led the election of Donald Trump in 2016 on, as I would say, very strong anti-trade platform. And one of the reasons why he won is because at that point in time, a number of US citizens were against free trade. They believed that free trade cost the US jobs. And one of the reasons why people say this was the case is because household incomes, real incomes in the US rose very, very, very slowly from the 70s up until 2000. So a lot of that frustration sort of boiled into this anti-trade sentiment. And then you had a man like Donald Trump, who, as I showed you in the next slide, has always been very, very consistently anti-trade. So, and particularly anti-China. I mean, Trump started off being anti-Japan in the 80s. So, I mean, some of you who may be aficionados of trade history would probably know that the US had unleashed these trade wars with Japan in the 80s. And as a matter of fact, the current US trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, was one of the leading figures in the 80s. He was at USTR working on a lot of these issues against Japan. So essentially what they've really done is replicated that anti-Japan strategy to an anti-China strategy. But that has been possible because of someone like Trump, who not just in 2011 as the first tweet you can see, but from much, much before has been very, very anti-trade and like we should only manufacture in the US and we should be very, he's been very, very protectionist in his worldview. And that is something that he has been very, very consistent on. Probably one of the only things that he has been consistent on in his life and in his political career. So how did this whole thing break out? Just quick timeline of this dispute. Trump was elected at the end of 2017, took office at the end of 2016, took office in 2017. He initially began with what is called as a Section 232 investigation into the national security implications of imported steel and aluminum. So Section 232 is this one clause in one of the US 962 US Trade Act, which basically says that you can restrict imports of imports that threaten your national security. So Trump essentially said that because steel and aluminum is very critical for defense, I'm going to say it's a national security threat, and he started this investigation in 2017. At that point, China had realized that this was going to be a difficult presidency for them. So there was a Trump-Xi meeting in Florida, and that's when essentially actual discussions between the US and China began. IPR, of course, has been an issue that the US companies have been raising, as I said, for a number of years. So they used another clause in US trade law known as Section 301, so the 1974 Trade Act, which basically says is that if other countries take policy steps that penalize or burden US commerce, like for instance, technology transfers or IPR issues, or pretty much actually anything, it's very open-ended and very broadly worded, then the US government can conduct an investigation and take retaliatory steps to restrict trade against those countries. So that investigation was begun in August. By 2018, they'd had these discussions, they realized it really wasn't going anywhere. So start of 2018, US government levied these national security tariffs on all countries. And the reason why they did it on all countries is because they believed that Chinese steel and because Chinese investment in steel and aluminum had led to so much overcapacity in China that China had actually dumped steel and aluminum in so many countries. And then therefore this was a global problem and not just restricted to a China problem. So they put restrictions on steel and aluminum coming out from pretty much almost all countries in the world, with a few exceptions, like Mexico, Canada, and so on. And then by April and May, they had completed the IPR, the 301 investigation. They started by putting tariffs on about 50 billion of Chinese goods. That was mostly high-tech goods. But by the latter half of 2018, they escalated that and on another 200 billion of goods. That included things like travel goods, that looked like furniture, a lot more consumer, every day-to-day goods that people buy, that businesses buy. That spooked China a little bit more. So there was a meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi at the outskirts of on the sidelines of the G20 meeting in November. There was a truce agreed then. So negotiations then took place through the first half of 2019. But apparently in around May, the story goes is that a number of hardliners in the Chinese government managed to get their way, and China backtracked for a number of commitments that it had already made. So in response, the US raised tariffs on goods that had already been tariffs, and in fact said, okay, there are about 300 billion of goods that are left that we haven't tariffed. We're now going to put tariffs on all those goods. And they started that process on about, I think, half of those goods, which includes a lot of apparel, toys, really stuff that people buy in a Walmart or a Target, like day-to-day, struggling, underprivileged families, goods that they buy. That's what was the subject of the last round of tariffs. And then eventually, because of so much action, and China retaliated on all of these actions that they did. They didn't take any of this lying down. But because there was so much action and retaliation, the negotiation, those pressure for talks kept building, and eventually in January of this year, they concluded what is called a phase 1 trade agreement with the promise to negotiate a phase 2 agreement in the future. And as part of that phase 1 agreement, a number of commitments were made by China that we will change these policies, we will increase our imports from the US. And in response, the US delayed some tariffs that were supposed to go into effect, or decreased some of the tariffs that had already gone into effect. And you can see there was correspondingly an impact on US-China trade. I won't really get into too much, but you can see that from 2018 to 2019, imports have fallen. The trade deficit has also fallen by around 20-25%, so has had a significant impact on Chinese goods. And actually what we're seeing right now in 2020 is that there has been a huge collapse. Like, I believe 2020 current figures, Chinese trade to the US is down by around maybe 30%, possibly could be more. Obviously, monthly figures change, but it's in a really bad situation right now. But it's not just on trade that actually this conflict has broken out. In fact, what this current administration in the United States is doing is focusing on what is called an overall economic decoupling. They want to decouple the US and the Chinese economies, which is a massive two economies that have integrated themselves so strongly over the last 20 years, and you're trying to like break them apart. It requires a very, very wide effort. And that's essentially what the US government is doing. And they've gone across sectors, which I'm summarizing for you here. But if I start at the top left, if I look at just technology, AI, and robotics, there's a lot of increased scrutiny of Chinese companies. In 2018, the US expanded. There's this committee which monitors foreign investment in the United States. Usually it's been very, very relaxed in terms of what it does, but its powers were expanded in 2018, particularly focusing on Chinese takeovers of US technology companies. And then very recently, Trump has banned a number of Chinese students that are linked to what China calls military-civil fusion. So what the US is saying is that if there are any students that have been part of those programs, then you cannot study in US universities. On the surveillance sector, the US has banned a number of Chinese companies, Hikvision, Dahua. I'm sure, I don't know whether you all are familiar with these, but they've banned these from the US market. There are export controls, so US chip makers cannot supply to these companies. The third point that is there is labor and human rights. And I want to just spend a couple of minutes on this. Under the 1930 Tariff Act, which is the Smoot-Hawley Act that I referred to earlier, that has a section known as Section 307 that bans the entry of any goods into the US that are made with forced labor. But when that act was initially put in place in 1930, there was an exception to it, that if the demand of that product in the US was less than the supply, domestic demand was more than domestic supply, then even if the product was made with forced labor from outside the US, you could not ban the entry of that good. In 2015, there was an act passed known as the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act that removed this exception. So now what has happened, excuse me, is that US customs now being empowered has increased its oversight of goods coming into the US. And if customs has evidence, or actually not even evidence, if it has an allegation that this good is made with forced labor, and if customs believes that, this allegation has some merit to it, it's very non-transparent how they do it. But if they just believe, using their feel or their gut, that, or whatever reasoning that they've got, which we haven't seen, that these goods have been made with forced labor, they'll stop your shipments at the port of entry, they'll seize it, and they won't allow it to come inside, and they will publicly say so you will have a lot of reputational damage. So that has started increasing, particularly with China, particularly with what they're doing with Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. So that's another area where the US has started increase its enforcement. But apart from that, of course, human rights related to Hong Kong, there are new provisions that are coming in. And of course, there are a number of sanctions that they've levied on Chinese Communist Party officials. There was an airplane ban that happened a while ago, in reciprocal ban to China banning US airlines. Now that has been reversed from both sides. The US also, through the NDAA, is an act known as the National Defense Authorization Act. That's essentially like it's an annual defense spending bill that is passed every year. So in the 2019 NDAA, they banned all government procurement of drones from a Chinese company known as Dajiang Innovations. And Dajiang reportedly has 60 or 70% of the drone market. But there are allegations that it's essentially providing all its information back to the Chinese government. And there have been reports that have made these allegations. So the US government banned it. I don't want to get into too much detail on Huawei and ZTE, which you all are aware of. It's a big issue in India as well. I do want to add that the US FCC, which is the Federal Communications Commission, the equivalent, the telecom regulator, the equivalent to our TRAI in India, is now revoking the licenses of all Chinese telecom companies in the US. It's not just Huawei and ZTE, but also China Telecom and a couple of others, and essentially just kicking them out of the US market. And then the last point is on financial services and financial access. There's a new act which requires Chinese companies to adhere to US accounting practices. Chinese companies don't do that at the moment, but now they're saying that if you want to be listed on the Dow or on the NASDAQ, you have to follow these practices, otherwise you will be kicked out. And actually the NASDAQ has recently delisted a couple of Chinese companies because of fraud allegations. So this area of cutting off Chinese companies access to US capital is now an emerging area, and the US government is definitely focusing on this. Added to this, of course, is sanctions on financial institutions in Hong Kong, which is also upcoming, and that's basically geared at targeting Hong Kong, which is a gateway for capital to go to China. So if we break that gateway, which is Hong Kong, that will affect capital going into China, and that's another hit that the US can make. So essentially, this economic conflict is across sectors, across policies. It's not just specifically related to trade tariffs and other trade-related areas. So what's the legal basis? I've already talked about this a little bit. As I said, Section 232 is of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. This is the national security exception that the US is using. But this has also led to concerns within the US that, the Trump administration is actually abusing this provision, because this was never really designed to be used the way that Donald Trump was using it. And while it's debatable whether you can say that steel and aluminum are important for national security, but Trump has also escalated this to auto components. And that becomes a little bit of a stretch as to how auto components is so critical and essential to national security. And the reason why Trump is focusing on auto components is because he's using that to go after the EU, and particularly going after Germany. Because Germany is one of Germany's key imports into the US is auto parts. And so he believes that Trump believes that he can bring the EU to the negotiating table by essentially putting a 25% tariff on German auto parts. But that has actually led to a lot of pushback in the US, because they think he's abusing this power. And in fact, the US Congress actually has a bill. There are proposals within the Congress to rein in the president's powers on Section 232. But because it's being pushed by the Republican Party, and because Trump is very, very powerful within that party, there's not enough critical support for that initiative yet. So there are maybe 2 or 3 senators that are very vocal, but the leadership and the powers that be have not don't really want to go against Trump at this moment, so that it's not really moved far yet. But there is existing opposition in the US to the use of this particular tool. There isn't that much opposition, of course, to the use of Section 301 because IPR and such concerns have been pretty long standing there. So it was kind of expected that something like this would happen, and that's exactly what the Trump administration has done. Apart from these specific trade enforcement provisions that they've got, the existing trade remedy infrastructure, that's countervailing duties, anti-dumping duties, US has been very, very strong on these in the last 3-4 years. Usually, and in most countries, you only begin trade remedy investigations when there are petitions from industry. But what the US government has started doing, what the Department of Commerce has started doing, is started self-initiating. So, we don't need some industry to tell us that they're being hurt. If we think that imports are rising or this is a serious issue, we just started by ourselves. And through these new investigations, they're also now coming up with new methodologies, new criteria. So as earlier they would have said that you need to provide a direct subsidy to be considered as a countervailable subsidy. But now what they're saying is that if you artificially devalue your currency, that's equivalent to a subsidy. So now we will consider that as a criteria when we do our investigation, and we will therefore raise our dumping margins if you are manipulating your currency. And this is completely new. No one really does this, but again, it's the US that it started this sort of creative reinterpretation of existing rules to basically punish its other trade partners. And then lastly, of course, is the executive authority of the president, which he has very, very extensive authority provided to him by the US Congress to take these actions. And one point that I want to make here is that, again, creative reinterpretation of existing authority. What Trump has done in many cases is that he's declared national emergencies, and then therefore he's used powers that he's got as part of those emergencies to enact trade restrictions. So to give you an example, on the technology sector, last May he came out, he said that foreign adversaries such as mostly China but also Russia have really increased hacking and IT espionage and technology-based cyber espionage into the United States. So therefore, because of this, we are facing a national emergency, and therefore I declare that there's a national emergency, and I direct the government to come up with this new system by which we can block any transactions in the technology space that would benefit a foreign adversary, right? So the government needs to come up with this whole new system. Now that system is being prepared. So this is something completely new. I declare an emergency and say that, under this emergency, I am now going to take these measures to restrict trade. And then partly using the COVID-19 emergency, you've banned Chinese airlines, you're using that to ban Chinese students, a number of other initiatives that they've taken. But apart from what they've got existing laws, there are a number of new laws also that the Congress has been passing, which gives the administration more teeth. So I've already talked about the National Defense Authorization Acts, and there have been bans on specific companies. Huawei, ZTE, we know about, Telecom, Hikvision, Dahua, the surveillance companies, Dajiang for drones, the focus on Chinese accounting standards, and throwing out companies like Baidu and all from the Dow. I've talked about investment screening, which happened in 2018, largely focused on the technology sector. I've talked about human rights and forced labor, closing loopholes that would allow goods from places like Xinjiang to come in. There are also additional legislations that are still pending that would advocate even stronger measures on, automatically, there's one law which says we automatically assume that any goods made in Xinjiang is made with forced labor. So basically the criteria there is that if this good is made in Xinjiang, it will not come. Or if this good is made from cotton produced in China, it cannot come, right? So those are some of the measures being discussed. And of course, last but not least, of course, you've got financial sanctions that you're directly going after certain CCP officials, particularly related to Xinjiang and Hong Kong. So where is this likely to go in the future? The phase one deal that I spoke about is under threat. Firstly, because China itself might not be able to meet its commitments because of COVID-19. It's got very ambitious commitments that it had agreed to. There was always a doubt whether it would be able to meet them when the deal was negotiated. And now because of COVID, it's almost next to impossible that they would do it. But having said that, the focus of Trump and the Republican Party for the 2020 election is going to be anti-China. And that's because of the coronavirus. And because Trump's handling of the coronavirus has been, there's a lot to be desired there. One election strategy is going to be to sort of deflect the blame onto China and put the blame for the entire coronavirus disaster on China and say that this happened because they didn't report it in time, right? So the plan is to basically escalate China bashing up until November. And while you're doing that, it becomes difficult to also say that, oh, the trade deal is working out. So the question really is that whether the trade deal survives until November or it survives beyond November. It's not likely. If Trump does win, he would probably come back recharged. What he will say is that, oh, China has not lived up to its trade deal. He'll probably have some reasoning for him to justify that. And he'll go hammer and tongs about that, cancel the deal, go back and levy tariffs on all products coming in from China, excuse me, accelerate the decoupling of the US and the Chinese economies, try and get American companies to move their supply chains out of China in the hope that, there either could be a deal or companies just follow what he says. In the case of a Biden victory, the interesting point to note is that Trump is really not a standard Republican. Republicans have generally been very pro-trade. Trump is different from that he's anti-trade specifically with China. But the Democrats historically, and even now, are actually even more hawkish on China and China trade than the Republicans. They're very, very close to Trump. And they've been very critical of Trump that they believe that the deal that he gave to China was actually a giveaway. He didn't actually get enough from China. So even if Biden wins, it's very, very unlikely that he will be able to reduce the conflict. He will need some justification to remove the tariffs. That justification for him is not going to be easy to find. And he's going to be under pressure from his own party not to de-escalate that conflict. So it's unlikely that even in a Biden victory, we are going to see some of these tariffs going away. But the difference that we could see in a Biden victory, in a difference in approach could be, one, there may be a lot more focus on labor and environment. So again, that could be an escalation of the issue. More issues now are conflict issues apart from IPR and what Trump has been raising. But Biden may also go in with a more multilateral approach, try and get the EU and Japan and India and other like-minded countries, Canada, for instance, to sort of join together to basically put pressure on China. And in fact, the Trump administration has tried that, but on a very, very small basis. Like the US, EU, and Japan have an initiative to reform industrial subsidies, which is again targeted at Chinese subsidies. But that's literally the limit as to what the Trump administration has done in terms of the multilateral approach. So moving on, getting into the India dispute, this is sort of a microcosm of the US-China dispute. It's not as intense. Certain similarity in terms of issues, general direction of where things have gone. Again, there have been a number of private sector complaints that US companies have raised. I'm sure you're all very familiar with these companies from many countries. In fact, some of our own Indian domestic companies raised the same complaints. A lot of these have led to WTO disputes between the US and India. There was a dispute on solar panels that related to a localization issue. The Indian government said that solar panels in India need to have a minimum of 40% domestic content. That was found to be contrary to national treatment by the WTO. We lost the case, and now there's a workaround on that. Similarly, on subsidies, US and EU challenge our subsidies. Poultry, there's been a dispute in the past, and I talked about special and differential treatment. That's something that has been particularly raised by Donald Trump and Robert Lighthizer as part of this administration. And now, of course, there are new emerging concerns that have now come up. Digital taxes, data localization. Digital taxes, the US feels is an initiative that is targeted only at US companies because the largest tech companies happen to be American companies. And Google, Apple, Facebook, so on. And specifically, the Modi government has, as part of its import substitution strategy, has been raising tariffs fairly regularly on all goods since 2014. So this has also caused some issues with the US, particularly, I think in 2018, we raised tariffs on mobile phones and a few other technology products, and that led to a lot of opposition in the US. So again, similar concerns to China, but lesser in number and less intense. Current for now. Over the future, I don't know how this will go. So again, give you a quick idea of how this whole thing went forward. India was subject to the same National Security 232 investigations as China and all the other countries. Trump and Modi had their first meeting in June. That's when, again, trade discussions began, but not in a lot of seriousness. In 2018, there were tariffs levied on steel and aluminum goods from India. We planned a retaliation then, but the Indian government decided not to put that into action. And then the actual issues began when the US began its investigation into our eligibility of what is called the GSP Trade Preference Program. Now, the GSP program is full form Generalized System of Preferences. This is a program that is generally provided by developed countries to developing countries, and it's a one-way unilateral trade benefit program. So the US says is that for developing countries, for a certain basket of products, these countries can export these products duty-free into the US, only these developing countries, so that it helps in their development, it helps in generating jobs. And once these countries, sort of when GDP per capita rises and they become middle income countries or upper income countries, then they lose eligibility for this program. And so the EU has such a program, the US has a similar program, Canada has a program, even India has a program for African countries and so on and so forth. So India has been a member of the US GSP program, and the US GSP program has several criteria that you have to meet to be eligible. Like you can't be a communist country, you can't be giving aid to terrorists, you have to enforce arbitration awards, you have to respect labor rights. But one of the criteria is you have to increase market access into your own country. And as I said, there have been a number of complaints from US companies. So essentially what the US did was they took two of those complaints from the dairy industry, the medical devices industry, and said India is not in compliance with the market access criteria, so we're going to investigate this. And that led to intense negotiations throughout 2018, most of 2019, the multiple meetings from Trump and Modi. And then eventually, once the Modi government won its second term, I believe within 15 days is when the US pulled India's GSP status, removed all those benefits as leverage to get India to concede more. But this time, when that happened, India retaliated. And the retaliation that was supposed to have gone in 2018 for the steel and aluminum tariffs, that is what they hit back with in mid-2019. And of course, following then, there have been multiple discussions, really haven't led. We've had several close calls. September 2019, when the Howdy Modi event happened, that was a close call. We almost had an agreement. When Trump came in February, there was very, very close. Agreement didn't happen. But now, following COVID, of course, a couple more issues have come up. One, the US has begun a 301 IP investigation on our digital taxes. As I said, this unfairly burdens US commerce. And now this H-1B ban that will disproportionately affect Indian companies and Indian people in the US. So again, we're now moving to a more more conflict and that period than more discussion period. Again, on just a couple of points on the GSP program for you all to understand, as I said, it's a unilateral preference program. It doesn't cover all products, so politically sensitive products usually stay out of it. So for the US, that includes agriculture, textiles, and apparel. These are not part of the GSP program. I talked about the eligibility criteria. Interestingly, one of the reasons why India was a target is also because we were one of the largest program users. In 2018, 24 billion of imports into the US were under GSP, of which more than 6 billion, that's more than 1/4, came from India. And in fact, if we look at India, Thailand, and Brazil, these three countries actually cover about 40 to 50% of the entire US GSP basket. So their idea was that if we can hit these three countries, we can really reduce our GSP exposure. So India, as you know, they've kicked out. Thailand, they removed about 1/3 of the benefits last year, early this year. Brazil, they're talking about an FTA. So once Brazil gets an FTA, it will be out of the program. Turkey was another large player. They kicked Turkey out because they said that Turkey has now become a rich country, doesn't need this program. So this is a major focus on GSP. And India was thrown out in April and May 2019. But did that really have an impact on our exports to the US? Not really, because as I said, it was really a small component. Our exports in 2018-19 were close to 60 billion, of which 6 billion was under GSP. It's only about 10%. And it was largely some chemicals, auto components, and some engineering goods. So auto components, the US is not really our largest market. For the other two products, they're competitive enough that the GSP impact really didn't have that much. And the trade deficit also was actually decreasing until 2018. But that's a bit of an artificial sort of trend, because the only reason it decreases is because we upped our purchases of oil and natural gas, which earlier we would buy from countries like Iran. But because of US-Iran issues, we stopped those purchases, instead started buying oil from the US. And that's essentially why you see this trade deficit, the red bars go down from 2017 onwards. Again, on what's the basis for this dispute, I've already covered a number of these issues. One that I would add here would be, or a couple that I would add here would be, one, of course, enforcing the conditionalities of these unilateral trade preference programs, the GSP program. There was not a lot of enforcement earlier, but there is right now. It's something new. Again, that's a new interpretation, new actions on existing laws that the US is doing. And in the case of the H-1B program, they actually used an Immigration Act from the 50s and the 60s to restrict H-1B visa holders in the US. So it's not just usage of trade legislation, but it's also usage of other legislation to put forward a trade restrictive measure. And what does this look like in the future? Of course, there are talks happening between the US and India. They're cutting across a number of issues. These talks are towards a limited deal, so that limited deal will not cover all these issues that I have listed. It will probably cover just a subset of these issues. And both countries essentially need to figure out a sweet spot for this limited deal in terms of what they want to cover. So discussions had actually been ongoing, but they were suspended because of the coronavirus. They were supposed to have resumed last week. India will have to provide certain concessions to the US. There is a lot of political will on both sides for this deal. And there will be some possibly GSP restoration for India, but that's not something that is a major demand of the Indian government. In fact, that's more of a face-saving gesture. And in fact, our Commerce Ministry has gone on record to say that they are not prioritizing the restoration of the GSP program because they believe that India is now a major economic power. It does not need to be part of such unilateral trade benefit programs, which are more for developing countries. And therefore, we need to be able to compete on our own strength. So the government in itself does not believe that GSP is a priority. But for the purposes of this trade deal, in order to make it work, they will possibly accept some sort of GSP restoration. They will not say no to that. External situations may also have an impact. As I said, there is a lot of political will on this that this government has, and partly the situation with Pakistan and China contribute to that. Um, Government needs support from the US and the EU and Western powers in various forums like the UN and so on and so forth. And particularly in the case of the US, government will have to give something back in return. And knowing that Trump prioritizes trade issues a lot, and it's a major campaign plan for him, that is definitely going to be a focus area. So therefore, there's a lot of that contributes to the will on the government to give something to President Trump on trade so that he continues supporting India on other issues. And we know that President Trump has weaponized trade in the past, so this is a strategy that the government is thinking about. In the case of a Trump victory in the election, as with China, it will escalate. The 301 investigation on our digital services taxes is going to go forward, particularly if there is no limited trade accord. The US is going to escalate its punitive trade actions on India. And there have been discussions in the US administration about a wider Section 301 investigation over the IPR issues that they have with us. So this would be very similar to what they're doing with China. And I believe in 2018 and 19, they were very close to actually launching that, but they didn't because the trade talks progressed. But if the trade talks don't progress, then this could not become another threat. In the case of a Biden victory, the disagreements and the issues will still remain, but the overall pressure could reduce. Biden may not weaponize trade as much as Trump does, so we may not necessarily need to provide them with concessions on trade for support on a UN Security Council resolution for that matter. So the overall pressure in India might reduce, but the tensions will definitely remain. So that essentially covers the US-China and the US-India disputes. I quickly just go into what the EU does. And actually, why am I talking about the EU? Because the EU is a very major player. The EU, if you combine all 27 countries, no longer, it was 28 with the UK, now it's 27. They have a combined GDP of about 16 trillion. That's the second highest in the world. It's behind the US and just a little bit more than China. In terms of trading, they're like the second largest trading entity in the world. So they have a lot of influence. They set standards. They have a lot of impact on what common regulatory approaches are being used. And particularly for India, for a lot of labor-intensive sectors like textiles, leather, footwear, they are our largest market. The US is not as big a market for us in some of these sectors as the EU is. Even in fact, steel, the EU is our largest market. We have very strong links with the EU when it comes to steel. So it's a key player, and we need to always keep an idea of what's happening in the EU. And how is the EU dealing with the situation? Well, the EU is sort of, you could say, caught in the middle between the US and China. It has similar issues with China that the US has in terms of IPR, technology transfer, subsidies. That's where the US and EU and Japan are working on that common subsidy, industrial subsidy proposal. But it also has major disagreements with the US, right? That regulatory standards was always a bugbear. The EU has blocked US beef from coming in for many years, saying that US farmers use these hormonal supplements and that those are bad for health. The US disagrees with it. So that's been going on for a long time. Subsidies to Boeing and Airbus has been going on for a long time. But until Obama, that was primarily a WTO. Those conflicts were handled at the WTO. But with Trump coming in, now that's become a full-fledged dispute. And now we might actually see a US-EU trade war over these digital taxes. So the EU has sort of been caught in between these two situations. Its response has been to go down the multilateralism route, try and get other countries on its side. It signed a number of free trade agreements with recently in the last 4 years, Japan, Singapore, Vietnam will go into effect, I believe, from August 1st, so at the end of this month. The Canada agreement happened 2-3 years ago. And Mercosur. Mercosur is a regional grouping of South America, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and one more country I don't right now recollect. Apart from that, the EU is also focusing on WTO reform because it believes that that's the best way to go about it. But apart from the whole cooperating with other countries and getting a group of countries together, they're also focusing on strengthening their own internal trade policy. So they've updated their anti-dumping, excuse me, their trade remedy methodologies. There's something which they've called a trade bazooka, which is a new trade enforcement mechanism that they're debating. Digital taxes is something that has become more important. And in general, we're seeing the EU become far more assertive on their priorities, and they've also started weaponizing trade to get focus on those priorities. So French President Macron has started coming out and saying that we will not sign trade agreements with any country that is not part of the Paris climate change agreement, or that does not adhere to what's required in the Paris climate change agreement. So that means a US and EU trade agreement cannot happen because the US is not part of Paris. So similarly, like those, there are a number of other areas that the EU is now becoming very, very more assertive. And so quick coverage on with their relations with these three other countries. Like I said, there's now possibility of a dispute with the EU or with the US on a number of issues. The 232 national security tariffs, the EU already retaliated against those when those happened. The Airbus case, the US has been authorized by the WTO to put more tariffs on the EU for the Airbus subsidies. Notably, there is a case in the WTO on Boeing subsidies that's going a little behind. But if you look at the trends, then the WTO will authorize the EU to levy tariffs to the US for Boeing subsidies. So again, tit for tat situation, and digital taxes could be a new flashpoint. In terms of what will the future be if Trump stays, as with China, as with India, it'll only be escalated. He is going hammer and tongs after the EU. The EU will retaliate. In fact, this trade bazooka that they've talked about, a lot of it is actually focused on the US. In the case of Biden considers the EU as his ally, so he will probably not unleash a trade war as Trump might. But those disagreements will still be there, and there may be a possible focus on the negotiation route to address those disputes. With China, EU and China are very large partners. They're discussing an investment protection agreement, but the EU is saying that there's a lack of ambition from China, which essentially means that China is not offering enough as part of that deal. So the negotiations are not really going anywhere. And the EU is now actually going after China more unilateral actions that you see from the EU against Chinese practices. They're even blocking Chinese investment, and that Germany is a key driver of that initiative. So again, aligned to what the US is doing. EU-India trade is sort of in a deep freeze. We had begun negotiations on an FTA back more than 2007, but they didn't really go anywhere because, again, the gap was too wide. So they were suspended in 2013. Since then, the chief negotiators have been having very regular meetings. But again, the EU says there's a lack of ambition from India, which, as I said, basically means India is not offering enough. And we're still in that sort of suspended animation, deep freeze situation. Both sides are very clear that they want to sign this agreement and they want to negotiate this agreement, but they haven't really shown the creativity or the ability to sort of, get past the existing roadblock. So that's essentially where it's at. So let me now just quickly conclude, leaving you with a couple of final thoughts on this. The first trend that I wanted to point out is that the area of what we call free trade is now over. What we're looking at now is a completely changing paradigm, and now we're moving from free trade to what is called reciprocal trade. And that is because there's a lot more skepticism of the trading environment. This has been since 2016. I've already talked to you about the Trump campaign and what happened in the US election, but at the same time, there was also a very, very strong anti-trade movement in the EU, which is led by civil society, certain political groupings in the European Parliament, other European parliaments, that almost torpedoed the EU-Canada deal at that point in time. So there's significant criticism and skepticism that trade actually helps, free trade actually helps. And this obviously contributed because the WTO has not been able to provide any solutions. And that has led to a lot of increasing protection under the guise of, I need to trade does not protect domestic jobs. Therefore, to protect domestic jobs, I need to restrict trade, and that's contributed to this increasing protectionism that we've seen. And COVID-19 is not going to help this. In fact, it's going to accelerate this trend. More countries are now talking about self-reliance. You're aware of Atmanirbhar Bharat. There's a lot more emphasis on local supply chains, particularly for critical goods. So the whole idea of moving away from free trade, that's COVID-19 is only going to accelerate that much further. And last point, that because of this skepticism that I've essentially talked about through this whole presentation, is that you're going to start now linking trade to various conditionalities, which I've been talked about in terms of weaponizing trade. So more pressure to reform what we call the rules of trade. If the WTO doesn't do it, then countries will do it unilaterally. They'll go it alone. Each country has different priorities, what they want their trade policy to get them. The US is talking about domestic jobs and manufacturing in the US. Taxation, digital taxes is another area that they're talking about. Every country is bothered about sovereignty and how trade will impact their ability to undertake, to put in place various regulations, labor rights, climate change, human rights. Countries are weaponizing trade to get other countries to move further on human rights. So there is this linkage of non-trade conditionalities to trade. And eventually what will happen is that as more and more countries go it alone, the WTO will get marginalized if there's no reform. And you'll have more of these exceptions. You'll have more free trade agreements. You'll have a lot more bilateral region-to-region agreements. And essentially what that could lead to are multiple trade blocs. So similar to what we had prior to World War II, when there were trade blocs that were empire-based. Then following World War II, there was the Cold War. So then you had the US trade bloc and the Soviet Union-based trade bloc. And now you probably have a US trade bloc, or let's say Western countries / trade bloc, US, EU, Japan, and versus the China model of trade bloc. So actually, let me stop there. I think we've already covered a lot and gone beyond the time that I had made out, but now I think we can open it to questions. If anyone has any thoughts, comments, please feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Akshay. That was a great session. We have a few questions. And we'll begin with Deepa's. Okay, now her emphasis is on whether such disputes are a fallout of capitalism and whether we need to switch towards progressive capitalism. Then going back to an old way of doing business. She writes that these trade wars, protectionism, and the policy of looking inward and strengthening the internal economic environment on the lines of America First, Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat package and all, is being done as the onset of globalization.
I didn't get the second part of that.
Sorry. Yeah, the second part is, again, I think the approach is on whether protectionism and a policy of looking inward is being dubbed as the onset of deglobalization. Something like a more localist approach there. Do you think that is so, that question? But also, if you want to sort of club this with another idea that you were ending on, I thought that could shed some sort of good light on some relevant aspects. Very often we see that when countries take a protectionist approach, the tangible benefit to a particular industry or the producer in a particular industry is more it's more visible, right? As opposed to the more sort of hidden impact on the consumer's capacity or purchasing power, which is sort of dispersed across industries, and the sort of equivalent impact that you see in terms of sort of the negative aspect in the home market for the consumer is something that remains hidden. That's why sort of politically it makes a lot of sense to approach this. So if you could sort of stress upon that along with the idea, okay, the elements of deglobalization and the like.
Sure. And it's a great question, and it cuts across a number of these issues. So let me try and break that down into it was was put in, that started by saying that yes, it is an outcome of the way, I wouldn't say that it's an issue with capitalism as such, but it's the way that capitalism is essentially run. Um, and yeah, perhaps a more progressive form of capitalism, which reduces income inequality and reduces the disparity in outcomes or opportunities within the system based on whatever your philosophy is. That will, if that does result in people feeling more secure, and if that results in people gaining more benefits, that will be helpful. Because as I said, a lot of the skepticism came in because there were these surveys that were done in the US that median household income really didn't rise from the 70s up until now. Like, it's pretty much stayed flat, real income. So people have not really seen, I mean, you've got politicians saying that, oh, trade is very beneficial to you and so on and so forth, but no one has really seen those benefits. Although those benefits have happened, they have not accrued to the people where it could have happened. And to get to, and so therefore, yes, because you've seen a trend and you've got people telling you that, you know, more globalization is helpful, but you've really not seen the benefits of that. That's not translated to you in your life. In fact, you may have lost your job because it's gone to a factory in a cheaper country. So for you, I mean, in terms of what's happened in your life, this has only been bad. So that's also probably what contributes to this entire anti-establishment, anti-expert feeling that we've got today, is because what essentially has been the prevailing wisdom over the last 20, 30 years, which was built on assumptions that may not have been valid then, have now been proven to have been incorrect. And so people are sort of, you know, are scared, are worried, they don't know which way it's going. So they're lashing out at things that they believe are the causes of these, and globalization and trade. And because, as you're absolutely right, the benefits for these are hidden, they take a longer time for them to come through. It's an easy target for people. And sure, if I go in with pure protectionist measures, there are very, very direct benefits that immediately in the short term you can see. So it becomes very politically easy for you to do, and that plays into this whole into this whole movement. And I'll make one last point on that. In fact, and this is clearly an example of how things, of the way the whole process is run, right? So, a lot of countries have a program, like when they sign trade agreements, right? You know for a fact that this trade agreement is not going to be beneficial for all sectors of your economy. It's going to be beneficial for some sectors which are competitive, so they will probably increase exports. But those sectors that are not competitive, it will not really have, I mean, those sectors will probably be hit. They will lose jobs. So people will lose jobs in those sectors. So when you sign a trade agreement, when you implement a trade agreement, ideally what you also need to do is you need to put in place programs that will sort of enhance the safety net for those sectors that you know is going to be hit by this trade agreement. And you have all that information. Every time a trade agreement is signed, there are multiple statutory and non-government organizations that come out with impact analysis and assessments that this agreement will be good for A, B, C of the economy, and it will be bad for D, E, F. But what we do, or what governments do, is they'll sign the agreement, but then they won't really put anything in to sort of help follow that, right? And that again is a major challenge. So there are things that can be done, but because they haven't been done, it detracts from the whole.
So we have another interesting question coming in from Shruti, who wants some insight on sort of tensions rising between India and China, and whether India can afford to block out China, especially with focus towards the technology sector. Sure. And what could be the implications of that?
Sure. So at the outset, let me be very clear that China is probably is far ahead of us. Far ahead. I mean, there's no comparison. We have talent and we have capability in India. I think the talent and capability, particularly for technology, that is available within India, is as good as anywhere in the world. But the problem that is there in India is that China has invested so strongly and has supported its technology sector so strongly over the last 5 to 10, possibly even more years, that they've really stolen a march over everyone else. And in fact, I would say that in certain sectors, China is more technology advanced than the US. And in certain sectors, it's made investments that are far exceed the capabilities of what the US has done. Um, Going again, and that's, you could say that that could be, that's a case for the wider economy as well. China has invested in its economy. Its economy is its manufacturing capabilities is the most competitive anywhere in the world. That's why it's the factory of the world. That's why most companies most companies are in China right now. When it comes to India and China, look, you can always cut yourself off from China. There's nothing is stopping you from doing that. What you have to look at is what will the impact of that be? Now, the fact of the matter remains that for many products, China can make those products cheaper than what India can make, right? For some products, only China can make those products. India can't even, or anywhere else, you can't even make the products. Forget whether you want to make those products cheaper or more expensive. You can't make those because those capabilities are not there. So for example, for certain active pharmaceutical ingredients, you only get those in China. So, I mean, if that trade stops, the company in India will have to shut down because it has no raw material or no input to really work on. So you will not be able to, for certain products, you will not be able to cut off that trade until you don't develop domestic capabilities that can compensate for that China trade. For other products, you can restrict imports from China, but then that will have a cost impact. It will become, excuse me, more expensive for India. That's a political call that governments will have to take if they're willing to take that dissatisfaction from Indian consumers. If they believe that people will be willing to do that, that's not something that I could possibly answer. Last point on that, what I would leave you as that, what I do believe, and this is what we have found also, is that India can definitely replace China as the factory of the world. In fact, India is the only country that can replace China as the factory of the world because India has a very large population. So before COVID-19 happened, when everyone was moving supply chains out of China, Vietnam was like, number one. Like there are say 4 or 5 countries that everyone thinks about, and India is within that list. But Vietnam has actually been at the top of that list for a while. And what we were hearing from some of our clients was that factories in Vietnam were actually refusing orders because they had no workers. Like Vietnam is not as populous a country as India. So there were just not enough workers. They said, we don't have the capacity to fulfill these orders, go somewhere else, right? And so India has the workforce to be able to develop the scale that China provides today. But it's not, you can't just have the workforce. You have to invest in that workforce, and you have to invest in a number of other things, which China has invested over the last 20 to 30 years. And what we have to invest in is the factors of production. So land needs to be cheaper in India and more easily available. Your entire red tape, regulatory requirements, compliance requirements, those need to be simplified. Those are very simple in China. Energy costs need to be much cheaper than what they are. Labor compliances and the entire labor environment needs to be much simpler and provide more protection for workers. So you have to achieve that balance. You need to get stuff through your ports out much quickly. Like on an average, it takes up anywhere from like 10 days to 2 weeks to get a shipment out of an Indian port. In China, it takes 3 days. I mean, by the time you get it out of the port in India, that stuff has already reached Los Angeles or anywhere else, right? So you have to invest in all these factors. And if you do it, companies will come and people will come to India to manufacture. They're just waiting to do it. We haven't provided the environment that they require. And China. So it's actually as simple as that.
We have another question, Akshay, if you're willing to take.
Sure.
If you're not too late, okay. This question is from Kavita. And it's a relevant concern that on one end we see an increase in the protectionist approach, and on the other there's an increase in digitization. So how can the balance be maintained considering digital colonization is a possibility, especially when there's infrastructure paucity for developing countries?
Sure. So you have to look at digital. Digital is a very new area, and most countries haven't really gotten a handle on digital yet. The industry, the sector, companies, private sector, what do you want to call it, that has evolved significantly, but the regulatory aspect has not kept pace with that, right? And essentially, if you look at what's happening in digital taxes, that is, I mean, it doesn't traditionally come under the form of protectionism, but that it's aligned to that aura. And why are various countries, and not just developing countries, but also developed countries, getting into doing these digital services taxes? Because what they realize is that what earlier you provided as a good, or earlier that was like, a physical provision, is now becoming digitized. So goods trade, the traditional forms of trade, our revenue from that is decreasing, and that revenue is now being shifted through digitization into these more digital services, right? So countries that would gain revenue through customs tariffs on physical goods now are losing revenue, because that is essentially moving to the digitization space. And that's exactly why you have these digital taxes. So I mean, yeah, so it's the reason why, so that balance has not yet been achieved, and that's basically because countries, really governments, are still evaluating. They still don't know very well how they want to approach this. They want to encourage and enhance growth, because they know that digitization has development benefits. So they don't, they don't want to excuse me, stall the spread of digitization, as it were. But they also don't want digitization to be a sort of a backdoor, so they want to regulate it to make sure that it's happening in the right way, but they also don't want to put brakes on it. And they sort of, most countries are sort of trying to figure out the balance between this. But no, it will be it's a cause of concern. In fact, it's a major issue now that's coming up. Localization is also linked to it. That's in a way protectionism. Now, if we look at data, what is data? Data is a resource. If my information, my personal information, is my resource, it's the same as my labor or my money. So if I am providing capital to invest, I have oversight and control over where that capital goes. If I am providing my labor to a company, that I have some insight of how that labor is governed and what are the conditions under which I'm providing that labor. Similarly, data is my resource, right? But I still don't have control over what that data is being used for. That's essentially why there's a lot of push on data localization, is because that supposedly it's a sovereign resource that the people of the country have, and it needs to be safe and secure and prepared. Now, is ensuring that all that data stays in India, is that the best way to do it? That's a debatable point. There are some people say that yes, it is. There are some people say that it isn't. But as I said, because this is a very new area, and because this is evolving very, very rapidly, countries and governments have not yet figured out what is the right balance. And that is something that is going to be a very, very major focus area going forward over the next however many years this is an issue that will be there.
Thank you, Akshay. That was truly insightful, and we're receiving similar feedback from our chat box that our participants, the audience, really liked the session and they found it insightful. So thank you so much for joining us, the New Youth Economic Association. We're really grateful and thankful to you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'm very glad to be there with you all. And if any of your students want to reach out to me offline, you can ask Ajay. Ajay has my contact details, so you guys can, if you want to chat, your questions, thoughts, please feel free to reach out. I'm available. I would love to.
Okay. Thank you so much, Akshay. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, guys.